One of the most extraordinary cases that came into the hands of Dr. Elizabeth Kübler-Ross, not through her hospital rooms in Chicago or her conferences at Shanti Nilaya in California, but through academic correspondence in the winter of 1987, involved a woman who had died 6 years earlier, thousands of miles away, on the sands of Upper Egypt. The case was not one of clinical death followed by resuscitation, but something that defied the conventional categories the doctor had spent decades studying. The possibility that human consciousness could traverse not minutes or hours, but entire decades, carrying memories of an existence supposedly preceding the current birth. Dorothy Louise Eady was born in 1904 in Blackheath, a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of London, the daughter of a tailor and a seamstress. Nothing in her background suggested the extraordinary, but at the age of 3, after a violent fall down the stairs of her house that left her seemingly dead for several minutes, something radically changed in the child. When she regained consciousness, Dorothy began to speak obsessively about a large house with columns, magnificent gardens, and a wide river. She insisted that this was not her true home, that she needed to go back home. Her parents, alarmed, sought doctors who found no neurological explanations for the girl's behavioral changes. The child cried constantly, refused to attend the family's Anglican church, and at age 4, when her parents took her to the British Museum, she ran through the Egyptian Antiquities Department as if recognizing every object, prostrated herself before a mummy, and kissed the feet of the statues, declaring that these were images of her people. Throughout her adolescence, Dorothy began to have recurring and vivid dreams. She saw herself as a young Egyptian woman named Bentrashit, who had served as a consecrated virgin in the temple of Seti I, the great pharaoh of the 19th dynasty in Abydos, during the 13th century before Christ. In the dreams, she walked through the temple corridors, participated in nocturnal rituals, and tended to the sacred gardens. There was one disturbing element in these dreams, a forbidden relationship with the pharaoh himself, which resulted in pregnancy. When the sacrilege was discovered, the young Bentrashit was reportedly interrogated by the priests, and to protect the pharaoh from any blame, she denied that there was a father for the child, taking the responsibility alone. The punishment for a temple virgin who broke her vows was death. In the dreams, Dorothy saw herself choosing suicide rather than waiting for execution, taking poison in the dark chambers of the temple. Dr. Kübler-Ross, examining the first pages of the report that had reached her through a colleague from the International Association for Near-Death Studies, immediately recognized the elements she often found in her patients: vivid and detailed memories, narrative consistency, deep emotional elements, and above all, the absolute sense of truthfulness experienced by the subject. But there was one crucial difference. Her patients described experiences lasting minutes, perhaps subjective hours. Dorothy Eady described an entire life with a richness of detail spanning years of a complete existence in another time. In 1933, at the age of 29, Dorothy married Emin Abdel Meguid, a young Egyptian studying in London, and finally fulfilled her desire to return to Egypt. They had one son, whom Dorothy insisted on naming Seti in honor of the pharaoh. The marriage didn't last. Emin couldn't live with his wife's obsession with the Egyptian past and the rituals she secretly performed. After the separation, Dorothy began to be called Omm Sety, Mother of Seti, following the Arabic tradition of identifying women through their sons. This would be the name by which she would be known in the following decades. In 1956, Omm Sety got a job at the Egyptian Department of Antiquities, initially working in Cairo, drawing and cataloging artifacts. Her knowledge of the hieroglyphic language, which she claimed to have learned spontaneously, impressed professional Egyptologists. But her goal had always been to reach Abydos, the holy city of Upper Egypt, where the temple of Seti I was located. In 1957, she finally managed to transfer to Abydos and spent the last 24 years of her life living in a mud brick house near the temple, working as a draftswoman and research assistant for archaeologists of various nationalities. The archaeologists who worked with Omm Sety at the Abydos excavations recorded phenomena that defied conventional explanations. She pointed out specific places where they should dig, describing what they would find before the shovels even touched the ground. On several occasions, her indications proved correct. She described the location of a garden that would have existed in the temple in antiquity, detailing the arrangement of the trees, the species planted, and the presence of an underground tunnel connecting the garden to the private quarters of the temple. Years after her death, excavations confirmed the existence of the garden exactly where she had indicated, with archaeological evidence of an irrigation system and botanical remains compatible with the species she had mentioned. Dr. Kübler-Ross noted this verifiable information in her margins with a question mark followed by 3 underlines. Over her years of studying terminal patients and near-death experiences, she had developed a rigorous system for classifying accounts. Omm Sety's case clearly belonged to Category 3, experiences with verifiable elements that could not be easily explained by conventional means. This deeply troubled her, not because it challenged her personal beliefs, but because it challenged the scientific methodology she valued so much. Omm Sety died on April 21, 1981, at the age of 77, in her small house in Abydos, a few meters from the temple she considered her true home. Before she died, she had granted long interviews to researchers, including Hani El-Zaini, an Egyptian scholar who dedicated himself to documenting her case. El-Zaini spent years collecting testimonies from archaeologists, Department of Antiquities staff, and local residents who had known Omm Sety. In 1987, 6 years after Omm Sety's death, El-Zaini published, in collaboration with Catherine Dees, the book Omm Sety's Egypt, which compiled all this material. It was a copy of this book that reached Dr. Kübler-Ross's office in Headwaters, Virginia, in the autumn of 1987. The doctor was then 61 years old and at the height of her international fame. She had published On Death and Dying in 1969, revolutionizing the treatment of terminal patients. But her later works, especially on life after death, published in 1981, had been met with skepticism by many of her colleagues. Dr. Kübler-Ross read El-Zaini's book over 3 consecutive nights, making dense notes in the margins. Her training in psychiatry at the University of Zurich, completed in 1957, had been rigorous. She had been trained to identify mechanisms of psychological defense, projections of the unconscious, and the influence of childhood traumas. The fall down the stairs that Dorothy Eady suffered at age 3, resulting in loss of consciousness, could have caused subtle neurological damage. Cerebral anoxia, even brief, could have altered the functioning of the temporal lobe, a region known to be involved in mystical experiences. Early exposure to the British Museum and Egyptian images could have planted seeds in the child's unconscious, seeds that germinated into an elaborate narrative of a past life. The narrative of Bentrashit, the temple virgin who loses her purity and chooses death, could be an unconscious metaphor for a real violation that occurred in Dorothy's London childhood. But then, there were the verifiable elements, and these deeply disturbed conventional psychiatric analysis. Omm Sety had described the internal architecture of the Temple of Seti I, with details that only became known after excavations carried out decades after her first descriptions. She had drawn the layout of rooms that were still buried under meters of sand when she arrived in Abydos. How could a woman born in London in 1904, without access to specialized libraries in childhood, have accumulated such specific knowledge about an Egyptian temple that even professional Egyptologists did not possess at that time? Dr. Kübler-Ross considered the possibility of deliberate fraud, but this hypothesis ran into practical problems. First, much of the information she provided was not available in any publications at the time. Second, Omm Sety lived in poverty for most of her life in Egypt, earning a modest salary as a draftswoman with no resources to buy expensive books or bribe archaeologists for privileged information. Third, what would her motivation be? She did not seek fame, did not write promotional books, did not charge for interviews, did not found any religious movement. She simply lived quietly in Abydos, working on what she loved, and died in relative obscurity. The doctor scribbled in her notebook, "If fraud, then fraud without apparent purpose, which contradicts the pattern of fraudulent behavior." Over the course of her career, she had encountered several cases of people feigning near-death experiences to gain attention or money. These cases always showed telltale signs, inconsistencies in narratives when retold, increasing exaggerations over time, requests for donations, or attempts to monetize the experiences, histrionic behavior during interviews. Omm Sety showed none of these signs. Her accounts remained consistent for decades. She never tried to profit from her story, and testimonies from people who knew her described her as reserved, almost shy, avoiding attention. There was yet another layer of analysis that Dr. Kübler-Ross needed to consider: cultural and religious influence. Dorothy Eady grew up in an Anglican Christian family in Edwardian England, a deeply conservative society where reincarnation was not part of the dominant belief system. Unlike cases the doctor had studied in India or Tibet, where children claiming memories of past lives grew up in cultures that not only accepted but expected such accounts, Dorothy developed her memories in an environment hostile to these ideas. Her family was alarmed, doctors were consulted, she was seen as troubled. There was no positive social reinforcement for her claims, only rejection and incomprehension. This made it even more unlikely that her memories were psychological constructs designed to gain social approval or attention. The doctor had, in her personal files, hundreds of near-death experience cases collected over 2 decades of research. She had personally interviewed over 20,000 terminal patients during her career. Of these, approximately 300 had reported experiences during periods of clinical death or deep coma. What she had learned was that genuine near-death experiences produced profound and permanent transformations in the individual's personality. People lost their fear of death, developed greater compassion, often changed careers to care work, and reported a renewed sense of existential purpose. There was a recognizable pattern that transcended cultures, religions, and individual contexts. Omm Sety exhibited all these characteristics. After her supposed experience at age 3, she dedicated her entire life to a single purpose: returning to Egypt and serving the temple of Seti I. She gave up material comfort, family stability, and social approval. She lived according to principles that made no sense to her contemporaries, but which were absolutely consistent with the reality she claimed to have experienced. It was a biographical coherence that Dr. Kübler-Ross rarely found even in her most convincing cases. The transformation was not temporary or superficial, but sustained for over 7 decades until the last day of her life. In the winter of 1988, Dr. Kübler-Ross began writing what she called a personal research memorandum on the Omm Sety case. She worked on her farm in Headwaters, a 120-acre property. The farm had a small office with wooden walls, an antique desk, and shelves filled with books on thanatology, transcultural psychiatry, and comparative religions. She began her memorandum by acknowledging the fundamental methodological limitations of the case. Omm Sety had been dead for 7 years when the material reached her hands. There was no possibility of a direct interview. It was circumstantial, not experimental evidence. Any definitive conclusion would be impossible by the standards of empirical science. However, the impossibility of a definitive conclusion did not mean the impossibility of rigorous analysis. Medicine constantly dealt with unique, non-replicable cases that still provided valuable insights. The Omm Sety case was a documented human phenomenon, and as such required serious scientific attention, not summary rejection. Dr. Kübler-Ross then proceeded to examine the historical correlations presented by the case. She had extensively studied the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the Bardo Thodol, during her research on near-death experiences. The Tibetan text described experiences of consciousness after physical death. There were descriptions of bardos, intermediate states between death and rebirth. The text stated that, under specific conditions, memories of previous lives could be retained, especially if the previous death had occurred traumatically. Omm Sety's narrative presented elements remarkably consistent with these Tibetan descriptions. The young Bentrashit had died by suicide, a violent and traumatic death. There was an intense, unresolved emotional attachment: love for the pharaoh Seti I, guilt for having broken her sacred vows. Dorothy's fall at age 3 could have served as a trigger, a moment where the barriers between identities temporarily dissolved. The doctor also examined parallels in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, specifically in the texts about the Duat, the realm of the dead in ancient Egyptian cosmology. Bentrashit had violated her sacred vows within the temple itself, a sacrilege that contaminated the sacred space. Omm Sety's obsession with returning to Abydos, with serving the temple, could be interpreted as an unconscious attempt to atone for that ancestral guilt. In March of 1988, Dr. Kübler-Ross sent a preliminary copy of her memorandum to 3 colleagues, Bruce Grayson, Kenneth Ring, and Stanislav Grof. She asked for honest and critical feedback, emphasizing that she was genuinely uncertain about her own conclusions. The responses arrived over the following weeks. Grayson was cautious, pointing out that the case could not be classified as a near-death experience in the technical sense. Ring responded with enthusiasm, suggesting that the doctor present the case at a conference. Grof offered the most radical perspective, arguing that the distinction between past life memories and archetypal material from the collective unconscious was ultimately undecidable. In the summer of 1988, Dr. Kübler-Ross had long sessions with terminal patients at Shanti Nilaya, the care center she had established in Escondido, California. During one of these sessions, a woman named Marion raised a question that resonated deeply. If there is life after death, doesn't that make my current life less important? Dr. Kübler-Ross realized that this was precisely the question that the Omm Sety case raised. What was the meaning of Dorothy's individual life? The answer the doctor gave was that every moment of lived consciousness has absolute value, regardless of whether or not there is continuity after death. What made Dorothy Eady's life extraordinary was that she lived with absolute integrity, unwavering dedication, and clear purpose. In September of 1988, Dr. Kübler-Ross presented her memorandum at a meeting of the International Association for Near-Death Studies in Hartford, Connecticut. Reactions were deeply divided. Half of those present felt she was venturing too far beyond the boundaries of empirical science. The other half argued that boundary cases like Omm Sety were precisely what the field should be examining. Dr. Kübler-Ross concluded by saying something that was later quoted. "My responsibility as a doctor is not to decide what is metaphysically true or false, but to understand what is psychologically real and meaningful to my patients." The Omm Sety case reminds us that there are profound mysteries about consciousness that we do not yet understand, and that scientific humility is just as important as scientific rigor. In 1989, the doctor received a letter from a British Egyptologist who had worked with Omm Sety. The Egyptologist wrote that Omm Sety, despite her extraordinary knowledge, also made occasional mistakes. She sometimes confused details from different historical periods. The Egyptologist argued that this suggested that the phenomenon, whatever it was not perfect or absolute. Dr. Kübler-Ross found this letter particularly valuable because it introduced nuance. It was not a matter of Omm Sety being completely right or completely wrong. The reality was more complex. There were extraordinary hits and errors that humanized the phenomenon. The doctor integrated this information into her memorandum, adding a section on the imperfect and fallible nature of human memory, even in extraordinary cases. She reflected on her own patients with near-death experiences, whose accounts also varied in consistency and coherence. Some patients described their experiences with crystalline details that remained unchanged over the years. Other patients had more fragmented memories, which seemed to change subtly over time as they tried to articulate the inarticulable. Imperfection did not necessarily invalidate the experience. It merely humanized it and made it more credible as a genuine phenomenon of human consciousness. In 1990, Dr. Kübler-Ross suffered the first of a series of strokes. During her recovery, she spent time revisiting her files. The memorandum on Omm Sety was among the documents she reread frequently. She wrote reflections that revealed an evolution in her thinking. The experience of facing her own mortality so concretely brought new depth to her reflections on consciousness and continuity. She wrote that perhaps the wrong question was being asked. The question should not be whether reincarnation was literally true, whether Bentrashid had truly reincarnated as Dorothy Eady. The question should be, what does the phenomenon of deep belief in the continuity of consciousness through death reveal about the fundamental nature of human consciousness? Why do millions of people around the world develop similar beliefs about life after death? Were these beliefs simply psychological defense mechanisms against the fear of annihilation, or did they reflect something deeper about the structure of conscious experience? The universality of the phenomenon suggested that there was something fundamental in the architecture of human consciousness that resisted the idea of total extinction. The doctor speculated that perhaps consciousness was not simply an epiphenomenon of neural activity. Perhaps consciousness was more fundamental, and the brain functioned as a receiver of consciousness, not as a generator. These were speculations, she recognized, but informed speculations were the necessary start of all genuine scientific investigation. Every great scientific advance began with someone daring to speculate beyond the limits of established knowledge, always maintaining the willingness to abandon the speculation if the evidence contradicted it. In 1992, Dr. Kübler-Ross wrote the final version of her memorandum. She was 66 years old and knew her time was running out. The memorandum, which was never formally published but circulated among close colleagues, concluded with reflections that synthesized decades of thought on death, consciousness, and human meaning. She wrote that the case of Dorothy Louise Eady remained an unresolved enigma. The case existed in a gray area between the explicable and the inexplicable, between the normal and the paranormal, between psychology and metaphysics. For her terminal patients, the doctor offered a more direct conclusion. Cases like Omm Sety's strongly suggested that human consciousness was more resilient and mysterious than materialistic common sense acknowledged. There was legitimate room for hope, for openness to the possibility of continuity, without abandoning intellectual honesty. Dr. Kübler-Ross concluded by reflecting on what Omm Sety had taught. Dorothy Eady lived with absolute purpose, unwavering dedication, and complete integrity. Whether her story was literally true or an elaborate psychological construct, she demonstrated that living in alignment with our deepest convictions can result in a life of extraordinary meaning. Dr. Elizabeth Kübler-Ross died on August 24, 2004, at the age of 78 in Scottsdale, Arizona. She left an extraordinary legacy of pioneering work in palliative care and thanatology. Her memorandum on Omm Sety, found in her personal files after her death, served as a testament to her intellectual courage and scientific integrity. The case of Dorothy Louise Eady, Omm Sety, remains to this day one of the most well-documented examples of alleged past life memories. The case invites us, as the doctor always emphasized, not to hasty conclusions, but to deeper questions about the nature of consciousness, memory, and reality itself. And perhaps that is the most important lesson that both Kübler-Ross and Omm Sety left us, that there is immense value in living our deepest questions with honesty and courage, that there is dignity in maintaining mystery without falling into superstition, in remaining skeptical without falling into materialistic dogmatism, that every human life, lived with authenticity and purpose, contributes to the collective understanding of who we are. If you have come this far on this journey of scientific and human exploration into the mysteries of consciousness, you are part of something bigger. This channel exists to build a community of people who, like Dr. Elizabeth Kübler-Ross, have the courage to ask profound questions and the humility to live with uncertainties. People who value both scientific rigor and openness to mystery. If this content resonated with you, consider subscribing to this channel to continue this journey with us. Let us know in the comments which city you are watching us from, creating this current of knowledge and consciousness that crosses borders. And if you know someone who is going through a difficult time, facing questions about mortality or grief, share this video with them. Sometimes, a scientific and compassionate perspective on death and consciousness can bring comfort in moments of darkness. Together, we are building not just an audience, but a network of people committed to knowledge that transforms, to science that embraces mystery, and to compassion that recognizes our shared humanity. Thank you for being here. Your presence matters. Your search for understanding matters. And together, we continue the pioneering work, exploring the frontiers of what it means to be human and conscious in this extraordinary universe.